I'm here with Daniel Hannan, here in Mississippi. Daniel, welcome to Mississippi.
Thank you very much, Douglas. Lovely to be back. Lovely to be back at the centre.
Freedom and America. What are your reflections on the state of freedom in America?
Country defined by freedom, written into the title deeds, and culture is a product of institutions, and keeping the institutions right is the way of ensuring that we keep the freedom. We're recording a week and a bit after the horrible murder of Charlie Kirk, just after the funeral. I've been reflecting on what we always understood by free expression and cancel culture. To me, cancel culture means having pressure put on your institution or your employer because of something that you have said that is unrelated to your work or your position there.
Yeah.
And we always understood that it was fundamentally wrong to remove an academic because of something he'd said in a private WhatsApp group, or because he'd attended a conference with the wrong people, or been in company that somebody disapproved. And I think that's a really important principle, because it allows for private space, which I think is key to a democracy. And I think there's a real test for people on our side now. Are we prepared to apply the same principle? Let's take, since we're both Brits and talking in America, let's take the case of the president-elect of the Oxford Union, who...
This is a man who had met Charlie Kirk.
This is the thing I find hardest to get my head around. They had met and debated not 3 months before. So Charlie Kirk, for this guy, George Abaronye, is not an abstraction. He's not some monster put together by leftist TikTok feeds. He was an actual flesh and blood human being who had sat, as we're sitting now, and had talked in his typically civil way. In response to Abaronye's first question, he said, there's a lot in that. Thank you, that was a good faith question. The usual way in which he debated. Incredible to respond to that by saying, Charlie Kirk got shot, lol. Right? I mean, I find it really difficult to get my head around that, even with teenagers. But here's where the cancel culture thing comes in. Can he be president of the Oxford Union? I think probably not. I think he should resign, or his members should move against him. And the reason there is because it is directly related to his job. The Oxford Union is a debating society. It exists to promote free expression. So if somebody is going to a university saying, prove me wrong, and is shot, and your first reaction is other than uncomplicated horror, you're probably in the wrong job. But of course, that's not enough for people. People are demanding that he be sent down, that he be prosecuted. And that, it seems to me, is exactly what we were complaining about when the boot was on the other foot. And I was very struck by this. I happened actually to be online when we got that horrific video from Utah. And I noticed something, which is that my feed was full of either random nobodies saying appalling things, or people telling me about the terrible things being said by random nobodies. And this then morphed into people on our side saying, look, this is what the left is saying. And it wasn't the left, it's some teenage loser with an anonymous account somewhere, right? If you looked at what did Joe Biden say? What did Kamala Harris say? What did Keir Starmer say?
I thought Kamala Harris's response was actually quite appropriate.
They were all exactly, and most of our flesh and blood leftist friends, of course, were uncomplicatedly anti-violence. But the algorithms are designed to keep you mad, to keep you indignant, and to keep you online. And so they feed you this diet of the most provocative stuff. And by the way, the same is true the other way around. If you're on the left, your algorithm was feeding you a load of stuff about right-wing triumphalists saying, now we have to arrest all these people.
I mean, one of the things I found particularly depressing about the past couple of weeks, and I don't like talking about this because I like to be optimistic, but actually the past couple of weeks have been really challenging. And one of the reasons I think they've been challenging is because you've seen this tendency to look for and search out the worst in the other side. I mean, I can think of people who've been crass with some of their comments, stupid with some of their comments, but there's something about social media when the content of your feed becomes the yardstick by which you judge the actions of others, which is just hideous and bleak. What do you think what do you think we need to do? I mean, I don't think it's about purely algorithms. I think when printing was invented, we needed to adapt our expectations of the weight of the printed word, the written word. Don't you think we individually need to change some of the way we react to what we read online?
Well, I wonder whether there isn't an opportunity now to set some ground rules, because it's happened both ways round. The big change was Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter.
Yeah.
Because that changed all of the other platforms as well.
Yeah, he broke the monopoly of the left.
Right. Once you have lifted the censorship on one platform, it becomes impossible for all the others. Right? How can Facebook repress a story when everyone can see it on Twitter? So everything changed, and that made possible a different attitude. And I'm afraid also then enabled the overreach that we're now seeing. So again, if we are against cancel culture, if we're in favour of free speech, I think we need to be consistent about this. Yes, there is such a thing as incitement in law. There always has been in this country and in Britain. But incitement always used to be defined very narrowly.
As it is in America.
As it is in America. There was a case, wasn't there, in Ohio, of somebody who in the 60s had a Ku Klux Klan rally on his farm and started saying, we've got to avenge ourselves on the... I think he got the word wrong. He wasn't the cleverest guy, but we need to be revenged on the Jews, on the blacks, and da-da-da. And the Supreme Court overturned his conviction on grounds that no one was actually going to be incited.
So it's got to be specific.
There's got to be a real likelihood, right, that you say, let's go and attack that particular mosque or something, right? And you've got to mean it, and it's got to be realistic. Now, when I look at the demands for prosecutions coming from our side, they are not applying that test. So, for example, a dreadful rap band from Belfast called Kneecap, who were calling... there was a concert where they started saying, "Kill your Tory MP." The only good Tory is a dead Tory. Is it realistic that someone is going to leave that concert and plant a car bomb in the House of Commons car park? Right?
It's poor taste,
really.
but
it's poor taste, but it's not actual incitement as I would understand it. Or Bob Villan, who, by the way, also gloried in the Charlie Kirk murder, at the stage in Glastonbury saying "death to the IDF."
Again, very poor taste.
Very poor taste, disgusting thing to say. But is any of those stoned concert goers at Glastonbury going to jump on the next flight to Ben Gurion and assault the first soldier he sees? So it seems to me you've got to apply a very tough test. And I think there is an opportunity now culturally, when both sides have seen this overreach, to say, look, here are some basic rules. Here's what we mean by free speech.
Okay, so one of the basic rules should be, unless it's narrow incitement as defined in America, it shouldn't be illegal. That's not to say it shouldn't be socially ostracized for saying it, but it shouldn't be illegal. Can I suggest a couple of other ground rules? Maybe one ground rule we need is the idea of forgiveness. That people don't necessarily need to be a full-time jerk to do things where they're a jerk online. You get people... I can think of a case quite close to home here in Mississippi, where someone retweeted something that they shouldn't have retweeted. And in that second, they were probably a jerk. But is it really worth ruining their life over that? Maybe we need a bit more forgiveness.
I mean, we need a world in which the possibility of atonement and forgiveness is constant. I don't want to live in a world where everyone is judged by their worst moment of madness. And again, this is something since social media. The ground rules are someone has said something stupid in a split second of lapsed judgment, or maybe while under the influence of alcohol or whatever. You strip away all context. You forget anything that they've said up until that moment. You remove any possibility that they were being ironic or that they were responding, or and you always go to volume 10. You never say, okay, that was stupid, but they've apologized. It's always got to be, they have to be fired. Right? This is really what I mean by cancel culture. And we all saw really unpleasant people on the left doing that for a long time. it's no less unpleasant when it comes from our side. And I just think that's really hard for people. It is not. It doesn't come naturally to human beings to, if you like, to elevate process over outcome. We tend to be guided by whether we like the other person rather than by general principles. But I do think we need to have general principles because that's what ensures a free society.
I also wonder if one of the ground rules you perhaps need is, it's not so much a ground rule. Maybe part of the problem is that everyone needs a belief system. As humans, we all need a sense of purpose in our life. And if you don't have a belief system derived from religion, if politics becomes your religion, you end up thinking of good people as those who agree with you and align with you politically, and therefore people who don't align with you politically are therefore bad. And it strikes me that a lot of what we're saying, what we're seeing, is a consequence of a sort of post-religious belief system where people actually they scroll through their X feed to tell them how to make sense of the world. And X is very good for telling you what's going on in the world. It doesn't tell you how to make sense of the world.
Well, Tom Holland, I think, argued very persuasively in his great book Dominion that a lot of the secular left is really acting within a Christian framework in terms of how they see themselves defending the underdog and all the rest of it. Mm-hmm. But critically, without the forgiveness component.
Yeah.
And it was the difference in the aftermath of, we just watched the memorial for Charlie Kirk. It was the difference between his widow, who has an obvious religious framework.
That was
very moving. And the people who are saying, now we get the chance to get them back for this. Yeah. Because the secular successor to the Christian version just doesn't have that forgiveness element.
So if it's not been a great moment for freedom in America recently, with people who ought to be pro-freedom, perhaps because of tribal antagonism towards the other side, forgetting that, it's where do we're 250 years since America's founding next year. Where does freedom in America go from here? I mean, it's not been great for free trade either.
No. I mean, the change in trade policy has been so sudden. I really struggle to think of any mainstream conservative, any conservative leader in this country, who was protectionist before Donald Trump altered their career incentives. It came out of a clear blue sky. But the trouble is, protectionism is always intuitive. Mm-hmm. Protectionism rests on a number of instincts and intuitions that were designed for a pre-modern society. We're a hunter-gatherer species. And so the arguments of the protectionist or the mercantilist sound like common sense. We can't carry on with a trade deficit. We can't compete with slave wage economies. We need to grow our own food. We've got to protect strategic industries. All of these things sound completely normal. Mm-hmm. It requires a little bit of reading and a little bit of knowledge of economics to see that when those sentiments are translated into policy, they always make you poorer, But up until now, people have that's happened, right? Enough people have known. And I think one of the big reasons why it happened is because even if people don't understand why free trade works in theory, because it's counterintuitive, they could see that it worked in practice. Mm. And a huge factor, therefore, was the impact of the Smoot-Hawley tariffs after 1930. People came along and said, we are going to protect American industry, reshore jobs, bring all this revenue in. And it was cataclysmic. It turned the Wall Street crash into the Great Depression.
And for generations afterwards, people had that reference.
People then understood that. And I have a horrible feeling we may need to see that again. So as we are talking now, the last month's employment figures showed, I think, from memory, 78,000 fewer jobs, 12,000 of them in manufacturing. And this is directly being caused by price increases because of the tariffs. So the manufacturing companies can no longer get their component parts in the way that they used to be able to.
I worry that initially what happened is the tariffs came into effect and there was no obvious catastrophic shock. And so people then said, see, it's fine. I worry that the effect of tariffs will be underestimated in the short term, but very pronounced in the long term.
Well, I think they will be very pronounced now. I mean, partly because they were repeatedly struck down, because they were unconstitutional. I mean,
the I'll give you an example. I mean, we're talking in Mississippi. One of Mississippi's biggest industries is agriculture. Soybeans was a great Mississippi export. Soybean farmers in Mississippi are really hurting now.
Yeah.
And the reason they're hurting is because they used to sell more than half their crop to China. China has, now you can blame China for doing this, they put the tariffs on at 25% in 2018 and have now increased them in the past 2 months from 25% to 44%. The effect of that is basically to make it uneconomic to buy American soybeans. Now you can blame China for the tariffs, but China would say they're responding tit for tat. But, you know, I think there will be a lot of farmers here in Mississippi who are paying a very high price now for tariffs.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I'm afraid it is difficult. They're very hard to undo once you've got them.
Why is that?
Problem. Because you put, you know, the US has put huge tariffs, let's say, against Switzerland. Let's say that there's a change in the midterm elections, or that there's a change at the next election, that the next president says this was a mistake and we want to go back to free trade. What are you then getting in return for lowering your tariffs? The Swiss don't have really tariffs against the US. They don't really have any significant non-tariff barriers. What are they supposed to do? What can they give? Right? Mm-hmm. And so this is why, I mean, when you talked about that example of China raising its tariff in response to the 2018, the Trump 1 tariffs, it is often said, never by Trump himself actually, or very rarely, but sometimes by his apologists, they say, oh, well, no, this is really all about forcing the other guys to open their markets. If so, it's a rotten tool for doing it. Because if you look around the world now, China, Turkey, India, the EU, Canada, they all still have in place the reciprocal tariffs that they brought in 2018. You know, they are very, very difficult to take down. So the way of getting the other side to remove its tariffs is not to put tariffs up yourself. Quite apart from the damage that you're doing to yourself in doing that, it's to negotiate a much broader and more comprehensive free trade settlement where you remove all the other barriers.
Do you think that at some point the rising prices on consumers in Walmart, the pain that soya farmers are going through, do you think at some point it's going to force a rethink on tariff policy? Do you think that in sort of a year's time, 2 years' time, Trump may announce a change in tariff policy?
Well, it would be nice. A lot of the world is subject to the same pressures. You know, we've been in a protectionist mood globally since the lockdowns. And the lockdowns just made people a bit more introverted and a bit more demanding of state intervention. But the rest of the world has not responded in kind in the way that it might have done. So it is possible. I think there is the one country I have to say that has been impressively pro-free trade, other than the usual culprits, I mean Chile and Singapore and so on, is Britain. Britain, since leaving the EU, has been far from perfect, but has been much more open to international commerce than the EU or the US or China.
How long a gap was there from Smoot-Hawley coming into effect to us beginning to see the catastrophic consequences of that? I know you said it turned a downturn into a fully blown depression, but what was the time lag? It took a couple of years, didn't it?
Maybe less. No, I would say less than a couple of years. I think it was. You've got to remember that much more trade then was in physical goods.
Right.
So the tariffs of today do not apply to services.
Right.
Right. So in that sense, they were a bigger deal. Then again, the tariffs today are higher in many ways than they were, certainly on steel and aluminium, aluminium as it's properly called, than
aluminium, yes.
on other things. But no, I think we will see. I think we will see the impact of tariffs here from now on. I think you will see them in each successive month, and I don't just mean in terms of higher input prices and therefore lower productivity. I mean in terms of verifiable and immediate job losses.
Do you think, as well as rising job losses, people will say inflation is surprisingly high this month?
Yeah, we're seeing that. We're seeing that already. So yes, there may be a change of mood. There may be a change of mood after the midterm elections. I mean, interestingly, rather like with the free speech thing, because we live in such a polarized age, a good thing about the current moment, well, one of the silver linings about the current moment in free speech is that lots and lots of lefties are now suddenly pro-free speech, right? The people who were joining the pitchfork-wielding mobs 3 years ago are now all J.S. Mill, right? In the same way, I saw a Democrat politician on Twitter the other day posting a Reagan video about free trade, right? So there may be a moment when it is possible to return to some degree, because this is not just. I think it is largely to do with Trump having been obsessed with tariffs all his life and no one daring to disagree with him. But it is also happening in a context where, when he stood against Hillary, she was also making anti-Trans-Pacific Partnership noises and anti-NAFTA noises and so on. So there is that moment, and it may be that we have an opportunity to go back to the older consensus.
To be fair, I'm guilty of having been a pro-free trader, and I'm very pro-free trader, having slightly hesitated and self-doubted. Similarly with free speech, there were times over the past few months. I speak to you as someone who went through the Brexit wars in Britain. I remember what it was like to be in favour of Britain leaving the European Union. You were tolerated as an eccentric socially and politically until we won the referendum.
Yeah.
And then there was this horrific policy of process of demonisation. I can't think of it as. I mean, it was deeply unpleasant. Newspapers and television programs would almost imply you were complicit in murders. I mean, literally, it was that horrific. It was socially extremely unpleasant. And a little part of
even though we were the majority, I mean,
even though we were
treated as some weird kind of satanic sect of child murderers, but we were actually 52% of the population.
I mean, it was. I won't give you the sort of unpleasant details because it sounds all horribly self-pitying. But believe me, it was a deeply, deeply, deeply unpleasant experience for me and indeed for you and for my family and many other good members of the Brexit movement. Part of me, I'll be honest, almost thinks, right, let's get the other side. Let's have our retribution.
Of course, and I mean that's a very human reaction, and you dress it up to yourself by saying only when they have experienced this will they understand what the problem is.
Yeah.
But that isn't really why you're doing it. You're doing it because we're a tribal species, and vendetta and feud come very naturally to us. But overcoming those instincts and building general rules and a system of justice that is not based on vendetta and retribution, but on abstract principles that apply equally to everyone, is what distinguishes tribal war from a modern free society.
So when people want to get rid of Jimmy Kimmel, or I must be honest, I didn't know who he was. That probably tells you more about my TV viewing habits than about one of the most famous men on American television. But when he was removed from his TV program at the behest of a FCC bureaucrat, you're saying we should oppose that, just as we should oppose a conservative or centre-right administration in Britain taking out Channel 4 and the BBC.
If you cannot see, whatever your political convictions, that just as it is wrong to shoot somebody for saying things you disagree with, so it is wrong for the government to put pressure on a TV network to remove somebody because they were criticising that government, then you are not a believer in free speech. Now, it is always possible to say, oh, but this is different, because of course each case is unique, right? And it's what both sides do. Oh, no, but Kneecap is different, Jimmy Kimmel is different. Well, of course they're all different. But the presumption has to be in favour of not abusing state power. By the way, I mean, that's the key point, right? When you said you're becoming more of a free speech absolutist, I would say I'm becoming more of a First Amendment absolutist. The government, Congress shall pass no law, right? The government, yes, if you say obnoxious things, you can suffer social consequences. People can say, I don't want to talk to you anymore. That's, and yes, there is freedom of association. So if in a job where it is directly relevant, you say something that obviously, if you're
Just damage the reputation of the organisation.
Right, or I don't know, you're running an abortion charity and you suddenly come out in favour of abortion or something, then obviously that's not a free speech thing, that's is he the right person for the job thing. But what's different about Jimmy Kimmel from that is that it's the government. It's the state saying this is unacceptable, and that should not be a game that any conservatives is wanting to play.
So on a brighter note, next year it's 250 years since the experiment started. How do you think it's coming along?
Well, I mean, extraordinarily, by any normal measure, the city on the hill, the shining city on the hill, as Ronald Reagan then called it, the city on the hill is seen from a distance. It's a good metaphor. I mean, I think Jesus knew what he was doing when he said it, and certainly Winthrop and then Kennedy and Reagan knew what they were doing. The point about the city on the hill is that you're not up close. You're not looking at the cracked paving stones. You're not looking at people tipping their slots from their window. You're seeing the big picture. And I think it's really important to judge this republic by the big picture. It is, I think, impossible to find a country that has had a more benign impact on humanity at large. A country that took an abstract idea of freedom, turned it into a nation state, planted the flag of that nation state on the moon, looks now to plant it on Mars, attracted tens of millions of people from every continent and every archipelago to settle here. I mean, that is, the fact that the in queue is so much longer than the out queue is telling me that this is still seen as a shining city. Right? For most
people vote with their feet. They like it.
Now, of course it is imperfect. Perfection is not for this world. And it sometimes fails to live up to its ideals. Of course it does. That is simply another way of saying that it has ideals. But they are remarkably good ideals, and the fact that we fall short is a compliment to those ideals. And I think this is, when people condemn the US and say, oh, Guantanamo or, state assassination or whatever their thing, they're never really doing a like-with-like comparison. They're not saying, okay, but how does that rate versus, I don't know, Indonesia or Pakistan or somewhere, right? Because they are doing this country the compliment, backhandedly, of judging it by its own ideals. And I think that's a point that is often missed. When Martin Luther King was making his argument against one of those stains, one of those flaws, he didn't frame his argument in general terms. He didn't say all human beings wherever in the world should be treated this way.
I mean,
he called it the promissory note. He referred to the founding charter, the documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, as the promissory note, and he quoted them all the time. All men shall be created equal, right? All men have been created equal. And in other words, he couldn't have made that argument in China or Russia or Peru or somewhere. He was saying, you are not being the country you said you were going to be. And in the end, people said, yeah, that's true. That's and I think that's a point that is worth reinforcing. So at 250, nearly 250, what does that tell us? Well, first of all, that those documents worked, right? And so don't mess around with them. I always think it's quite instructive to compare North America with South America in this regard. The South American republics, in most cases, became independent between about 1810 and about 1822. The US Constitution was already seen by then as a successful model, and almost all of them copied it in some version or another. I mean, adapted, sure, but not one of them has managed to keep it. They've all lurched from coup to revolution to counter-coup.
The French had their revolution, but at the same time as the Americans, but they're on their fifth republic now.
Exactly. So first of all, that point number one, this is a formula that works, not because it's perfect, but because it's better than any of the functioning alternatives. Point number two, you have to really constantly educate and habituate people to the idea that this matters. And this does worry me slightly in our impatient, online, screen-addled age.